My husband locked himself in his streaming room during a family emergency, so I exposed him. When I first met my husband, he was charming, funny, and had this boyish energy that made everything feel light and exciting. He had big dreams. He wanted to make it as a streamer, turning his love of gaming into a career. At the time, I thought it was cute. He talked about how he'd create a space where people could hang out and laugh, and I thought, why not? Everyone deserves to follow their dreams. When we got married, it felt like we were a team. I worked a stable job while he spent his free time gaming. Back then, it was harmless. He played in the evenings, but he'd always make time for me. We'd watch movies, cook together, and talk about the future. I told myself it was just a hobby, and once we had kids, he'd step up. The first cracks started showing when I got pregnant with our daughter. His gaming sessions got longer. He began streaming late at night, saying it was the prime time to grow his audience. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom and hear him laughing with his chat. I asked him if he could cut back, but he always had an excuse. I'm building something here, he'd say. This is for us. When our daughter was born, I assumed he'd shift gears. I was wrong. He started spending more money on his setup, fancier microphones, better lighting, soundproofing panels. He said it was an investment in his career. Meanwhile, I was the one waking up for 3 a.m. feedings and learning how to function on 2 hours of sleep. He'd lock himself in his streaming room, telling me he couldn't be interrupted during a stream. By the time our son was born 3 years later, his hobby had turned into a full-blown obsession. He quit his part-time job to focus on streaming, even though he wasn't making any real money from it. I was left to cover all the bills while juggling 2 kids and a demanding job. Every time I brought it up, he'd say, "This is temporary. Once I blow up, everything will change." I made excuses for him for years. To my friends and family, I painted a picture of him as a loving, supportive dad who just happened to have a passion for gaming. Deep down, I knew the truth, but admitting it felt like admitting I'd made a mistake. I didn't want to be the woman who chose the wrong person to build a life with. Things came to a head last week. It was a Thursday, and I came home from work exhausted. I'd been in meetings all day, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch. As soon as I walked in, I knew something was wrong. Our 5-year-old daughter was playing quietly in the living room, but our 2-year-old son was nowhere in sight. I called out to my husband, but there was no answer. I found our son lying in his crib, his face flushed and his breathing labored. When I touched his forehead, it was burning hot. Panic set in. I yelled for my husband again, but I already knew where he was. I marched to the streaming room and, sure enough, the door was locked. This wasn't new. The lock was his way of ensuring he wouldn't be bothered during streams. I knocked hard and shouted that our son was sick. His reply came muffled through the door, "I can't pause right now. I'm live." I couldn't believe it. Our child was sick, and he was more concerned about entertaining strangers online. I grabbed the spare key from the kitchen drawer and unlocked the door. He was sitting in his chair, wearing his headset, grinning at the screen. The moment I stepped inside, his smile vanished, but I didn't care. I pointed to the crib monitor I was holding. "Our son has a fever, and you're in here playing games." The chat on his screen exploded with messages. They'd heard everything. Some people were asking if everything was okay. Others were laughing, treating it like some kind of soap opera. He looked mortified. "You're embarrassing me," he said, as if I was the problem. I didn't care. I told him to get off the stream and help me, but he just sat there, frozen. I stormed out and took both kids to the ER by myself. Our daughter kept asking why Daddy wasn't coming with us, and I didn't have the heart to explain. At the hospital, the doctor said our son had an ear infection and a high fever, but we'd caught it in time. I texted my husband the update. His reply? "That's good. I'll check on him later." The next day, he was furious. He said I'd ruined his stream and embarrassed him in front of his audience. He didn't apologize for ignoring me, for locking himself away, or for leaving me to handle everything alone. Instead, he acted like he was the victim. "Do you know how hard I've been working to grow my channel?" he yelled. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. This wasn't an isolated incident. There was the time I asked him to watch the kids so I could grocery shop in peace. I came home to find our daughter coloring on the walls and our son chewing on a power cord. He'd been streaming the whole time, completely oblivious. When I confronted him, he said, "They were fine. You're overreacting." Another time, he let our daughter stay up until midnight because he forgot it was a school night. She was cranky and exhausted the next day, but he didn't think it was a big deal. "She's a kid," he said. "She'll bounce back." I'd been hiding his behavior from my family for years. I didn't want to deal with the "I told you so" comments or the judgment. But after the ER incident, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. At a family dinner that weekend, his mom asked how things were going. Normally, I'd plaster on a smile and say everything was fine. This time, I didn't. I told them everything. The locked doors. The neglect. The excuses. His mom looked horrified. His sister, who has kids of her own, was furious. She asked him point blank, "What is wrong with you?" He tried to brush it off, saying I was exaggerating, but no one was buying it. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. He's still mad at me for airing our dirty laundry, but I don't care. I've spent years protecting his image while he sat in his streaming room, acting like a child. I'm done making excuses. If he wants to be mad, let him be mad. I have 2 kids to take care of, and they deserve better than a dad who locks himself away when they need him. I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know one thing: I'm done carrying this burden alone. If he wants to change, it's on him. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath. Update. The weeks after I exposed my husband for neglecting our kids were nothing short of chaotic. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every conversation between us turned into an argument. He still wouldn't admit he had done anything wrong. Instead, he doubled down on blaming me for ruining his career. According to him, it wasn't his neglect of our children that caused the fallout, it was my decision to confront him in front of his stream audience. I had made it clear that things had to change. I told him he would need to step up as a parent, and since I was the one working full-time, he would have to handle the kids during the day. He didn't argue, but he didn't exactly agree either. He was too focused on trying to salvage his online reputation. I'd hear him in his streaming room at all hours, ranting about how he'd been falsely accused and trying to laugh off the chat's constant trolling. His audience had not been kind. Clips of me barging into his streaming room with the spare key had gone viral on multiple platforms. People were mocking him, calling him Deadbeat Dad Live and Locked Door Gamer. Some even started coming into his chat just to spam questions about his parenting. Instead of addressing it maturely or taking accountability, he resorted to banning people and lashing out, which only made things worse. At home, he was useless. Our daughter would ask him to play with her, and he'd brush her off with a distracted, "Maybe later." When our son cried, he'd sit there and yell for me to deal with it, even though I was the one juggling work and household responsibilities. I started to realize that, despite all the drama, nothing had actually changed. He was still locked in his room, avoiding reality. I confided in my mom about what was going on. She had always been hesitant about our relationship, but she never said, "I told you so." Instead, she listened. When I told her I was considering leaving him, she asked me one question: "Is this the life you want for your kids?" That question stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What kind of example was I setting for my children by staying with someone who refused to grow up? I decided to give him an ultimatum. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat him down and told him how I felt. I told him he had 2 choices: get a real job and join me in couples therapy, or we would get a divorce. He laughed. "You're not serious," he said. "You wouldn't do that to the kids." I told him I was absolutely serious, but he didn't take me seriously. He accused me of being dramatic, of overreacting, and even of trying to sabotage his dreams. He called me controlling and said I was trying to emasculate him by asking him to get a job. "What kind of wife doesn't support her husband's passion?" he said. That was his go-to excuse for everything, his passion. At that moment, I knew he wasn't going to change. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't tell him right away. I wanted to make sure I had all my ducks in a row before I dropped the news. I started documenting everything: his streaming hours, his neglect of the kids, the texts he sent me blaming me for his online downfall. I needed evidence, just in case the divorce got messy. And it got messy. When I finally told him I had filed for divorce, he flipped out. He called me every name in the book, accused me of trying to destroy his life, and said I was brainwashing our kids against him. He refused to leave the house, claiming he had just as much right to be there as I did. I ended up staying with my mom for a few weeks while the legal process played out. His behavior during the divorce was nothing short of ridiculous. He told the court he was a stay-at-home dad who had been unfairly forced out of his family. He even tried to argue that his streaming was a legitimate job, despite the fact that he had never made more than a few dollars here and there from donations. My lawyer was prepared. We had records showing his total lack of involvement with the kids, as well as proof of his neglect. In the end, the court sided with me. I was granted full custody of the kids, and he was given limited visitation. He didn't take it well. He went on another one of his streams and ranted about how the system was rigged against dads, and how I had manipulated the courts. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. The kids adjusted surprisingly well. They started to thrive without the constant tension in the house. I moved into a smaller house closer to my job and my mom's place. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. I decorated the kids' rooms with their favorite characters, and we started new routines, movie nights, trips to the park, and Sunday breakfasts at Grandma's. The kids seemed happier, and so was I. As for my ex, he's still streaming, though his audience has dwindled to almost nothing. He occasionally sends me bitter texts, blaming me for his fall from grace. I ignore them. I'm too busy building a life where my kids feel loved and safe. Looking back, I can't believe how long I put up with his behavior. I think I was afraid of failing, of admitting that I had made a mistake. But leaving him wasn't failing. It was the best decision I could have made for myself and my kids. Now, when I think about the life I want for my children, I feel hopeful. They deserve to grow up in a home filled with love and respect, not one overshadowed by neglect and excuses. And as for me? I deserve that too.